Good morning. Today is June 28, 2021. I'm Frank Farmer, and we're here today as part of the Veterans History Project. Today we have as our guest Senior Chief Navy Robert Clark. Senior Chief Clark was a member of the riverboat patrols in Vietnam. This was a very dangerous job. Small craft up and down the byways and small canals of Vietnam, often very shallow. The canals were very narrow in many cases, less than 30 yards wide. The riverbanks had heavy foliage, trees, which made it easy for an enemy to ambush and to get away. And Chief Clark is only too familiar with the dangers of being on a riverboat because he himself was seriously wounded in action while in Vietnam. And we'll talk about that story a little later on in the interview. In addition to the Purple Heart that Chief Clark received for his wounds, he is also the recipient of the Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V, the Action Combat Ribbon, the Presidential Unit Citation, as well as the Navy Unit Commendation Medal, as well as the Vietnam Service and Campaign Ribbons. So with that background, let me welcome Chief Clark to the interview. Chief Clark, thank you very much for coming here today.
My pleasure.
Taking your time, and thank you for your service, sir, first of all. So we're going to start off, Chief Clark, we're going to want to talk about your Navy career from the beginning and till the end, and especially about your experiences on riverboats. The public doesn't hear a lot about riverboats in Vietnam. It doesn't quite get the same publicity as the air war or the ground war. But as I said, it was a very dangerous job. So let's start off by telling us where you were born and raised and how you happened to join the Navy.
I was born in Portland, Maine, September 1st, 1944, and lived the first part of my life in Westbrook, Maine, which is only 6 miles west of Portland. I attended Westbrook High School. Didn't graduate, got into trouble at home, and my father told me either you leave home or I leave. He says the house isn't big enough for the both of us. I was 16 and a half years old at the time, stupid. And so I went to school that morning, and I was very upset about the confrontation I had with my father. And my teacher told me to go home. He said, don't bother to go up. We had two portions of our school and about a mile apart. And the first area I went to was shop classes, which is sheet metal and woodworking and things like that. And then when we finished that class, we'd have to walk up to the high school, the main high school. And he told me, he says, don't even bother to go up there. He says, just go on home. He says, I'll call the school and tell them you're not coming up there. So instead of going home, I went to the Navy recruiter. And I told him I wanted to join the Navy. They asked me how old I was. I said 16. And they said, well, you can't go in until you're at least 17. Well, I said, I'm 16 and a half. No, you got to be 17. And I said, well, how about, I know I have to take tests and a physical. How about let me do that? He says, and then when the time comes, when I reach my 17th birthday, all I have to do is be sworn in. And they said, yes, we can do that. So I spent the day away from home in Portland, and I had to go over to Cape Elizabeth where Fort Williams used to be. It's now, it's a state park now. And I went there. They gave me my physical. I came back. I took the test, passed with flying colors. They said, well, all you got to do is wait until you're 17. And I says, all right. So when I turned 17, I got sworn in. And 5 days after my birthday, my 17th birthday, I was in boot camp.
Well, tell us about boot camp. Where did you go for boot camp? And when you went into the Navy, did you have any idea what you wanted to do in the Navy?
No. They ask you that. What did you expect to do when you was in the Navy? Well, the recruiter I went to, the only one I knew was the one who talked to me the most, and he was a torpedoman. And they said, so what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like to be a torpedoman. And had no idea what a torpedoman does. And my whole reason for going into the Navy instead of the other branches of the service was I saw the movie They Were Expendable with John Wayne about PT boats, and that fascinated me. I said, when I go into the Navy, I want to get on the small boats. And so when I went into the Navy, there was no more PT boats. So I was disappointed, but I said, oh, well. When I graduated out of boot camp, well, actually, I was in boot camp for 2 months longer than I should have been.
And where did you say boot camp was?
Great Lakes, Illinois.
That is the Navy's basic camp that everybody goes through when you join the Navy, right?
Right.
Okay.
And usually, when I go in on 5 September, before Christmas, I'd be gone. I would have graduated and gone on to a duty station. But I caught pneumonia and was in the hospital for 2 months. So I went in on September 5th. I didn't get out until sometime in February. And I was in boot camp for so long that I drew E2 pay. So
now here you are, 17 years old. You went into boot camp. It must have been a little bit of a culture shock to you because you had not traveled much outside your home area, had you? And
no, I never did. Being from a mill town, there's a big paper mill in Westbrook, Maine. That's where my father worked. And so I lived in that mill town my whole childhood. And when I went to Illinois, Great Lakes, I found out we was going to get a boot camp leave where we could take off for the day early in the morning and have to be back in the evening. And everybody in your company gets to do this. And so when we was going out the front gate, we was all in nice clean uniforms and all that and excited about going. I'd never been to the big city before. And so the guy at the desk says, you didn't shave. Now, I just turned 17. I had no beard. And I had very little peach fuzz. And he was just giving me a hard time. But he said, you didn't shave. You got to go back and shave. So my friends waited for me. I went back, shaved again, came back, and he says, you didn't really shave, did you? And I said, yes, sir, I did. And he says, well, you still didn't do a good job. You got to go back and do it again. I told my friends, I said, you guys go ahead. And I said, I don't want to ruin your time. So they left. So I went up again, and I shaved real close, and I got cuts all over my face from shaving. I come back, and they said, well, okay, you can go. No. I came back again. He said, well, you didn't shave. And I said, cutting yourself doesn't get it done. He said, you got to go back and shave again. So I went back and I decided not to go anywhere. So I sat down to write a letter home. And the phone rang. And he says, what are you doing up there? And I says, hey, my friends have already left. My day is about shot. I said, I'm writing a letter to my mom and dad. They says, you don't have a choice. He said, it's a direct order. Get your behind down here, and you're going on liberty. So I left, put my stuff away, and I went down there, and then they let me go.
Well, that sounds like a little bit of boot camp harassment.
And that's exactly all. That's all it was. That's all it was.
So when you graduated, how long was boot camp, by the way? How long did you have to go through the training, the basic boot camp training? Do you remember?
I can't remember the exact amount of time boot camp was because that was so long ago. It's about 60 years ago.
So when you graduated, you were not, you still had to go to specialty schools, did you not? That was just
Yes.
the basic. So after you graduated, tell us about where you went to. You said you wanted to be a torpedoman, right?
Yes.
And did you find out
I-
in the
I
Navy
made it.
what
I
a
made it.
torpedoman does?
Yes. I made it. I was surprised that I was going to make it because I had quit high school. Which, by the way, when I went into the Navy, I said that was the dumbest thing you ever did. And I really chewed myself out for doing it. And I says, from now on, rule number one, you don't quit anything you start. If you start something, you finish it. That was my rule for myself. So I went down to Key West, Florida, was my next duty station. And in Key West, Florida was the torpedoman school. And only about 50% of the guys get a school. The other ones go on onto a ship for on-the-job training. But I went to Key West, Florida, and I went to school, torpedoman school.
Well, torpedoman school sounds to me like you learned how to fire torpedoes. Is that
No.
correct, or is that not correct?
No, it's not correct.
Oh.
Torpedoes are a very complex weapon. Later on, I specialized in what they call the Mark 37 torpedo, and it would be about 14 weeks long to go through that school. Just for that one school, just for that one torpedo. And so I went through what they call A school, where you learn a little bit about this torpedo, a little bit about that one, a little bit about that one.
Now, when did you know that you were going to be assigned to patrol riverboats in Vietnam? When did that happen in your career?
I was on board my ship, and I picked up an All Hands magazine, and there was an article in there about PBRs. I said, oh my God, small boats.
PBR standing for?
Patrol boat river, or river
Right,
patrol
that's the
boats.
Navy's nomenclature. PBR, patrol boat river, right? All right.
Yeah, it was patrol boat, comma, river. So it was a river patrol boat, PBR. So I saw that article, and I says, this is exactly what I've been looking for. So I put in a request sheet to be transferred to to PBR school in Vallejo, California.
What year was that?
That was in 1968.
All right. So 1968, the Vietnam War was starting to really get heated up.
That really got
starting
heated.
to have a lot of casualties at that time. We were
Yep.
sending in more troops at that time. So you were going through training in PBRs at a time when you must have known you were going to probably be sent to Vietnam.
Yes. All graduates of PBR school go to Vietnam.
Now, what did you hear about Vietnam as you were going through your training?
When I went through training, I heard about this PBR that got ambushed, and everybody on board that boat was either killed or wounded. They had to send the other boats up to try to rescue them, but they couldn't get close because they was receiving so much fire from the riverbank. So the forward gunner on the boat got on the radio and told the other boats, he says, go downriver a short ways from where my location is. I'm going to throw the bodies overboard. And he says, we got a swift current. And the flak jackets we used to wear back in those days would keep you afloat until they got saturated with water, and then you would sink. So he made sure the flak jackets were on good. He drug all the bodies to the back of the boat and then threw them over the railing in the back of the boat, and then grabbed the M60 machine gun and ran across up to the front of the boat, jumped on the riverbank, and was shooting. The other boats came up and they rescued the guys that was floating in the water, who survived, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
And so they saw him up there shooting. His name was Ford, gunner's mate, second class Ford, and he was shooting at the enemy, and that's the last they saw of him alive. They found him later on. It sounds kind of gruesome, but tell me if it is. The VC had tied a rope around his torso, and they had cut his arms and legs off. And then they threw the torso in the river and held onto the rope, just to entice the boats to come up to get him. And every time the PBRs would come up to the river, they would shoot at him and get pushed back. Finally, they called in airstrikes. And 9 PBRs, and each one carrying 350 caliber machine guns. Now, anybody who spends time in the service knows how powerful a 50 caliber machine gun is. It's usually used for anti-aircraft and to be fired against buildings and bunkers and things like that, people that are entrenched in areas like this. And they had 9 boats with 3, so they had 27 50 caliber machine guns. And they went in there and they leveled the place. They said you could actually see trees falling down. And they went in there and they got the body. And Petty Officer Ford was recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he didn't get it. which really irritated everybody in our river division. But he did get the Navy Cross posthumously.
Speaking of Congressional Medals of Honor and the dangers of being on a patrol riverboat, I think 2 members of boat crews were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honors.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, a first-class petty officer by the name of Williams. I think he was in the River Division 532, but I don't really remember. But he got the Medal of Honor. And a seaman by the name of Ouellette received the Medal of Honor for jumping on a hand grenade to save his friends.
So he was killed.
He was killed.
My gosh. Now, being on a river patrol boat, and the audience may not know this, but is often referred to as being part of the brown, quote, brown water Navy, end quote.
Correct.
As opposed to the blue water Navy. So for the benefit of the audience, tell us what's the difference between the brown water Navy and the blue water Navy.
Well, the brown water Navy gets its name from the Delta. The water is all brown. You can dip your hand into the water and then look, and you can't see the lines in your hand. It's a lot of silt, a lot of grit. If you take 2 hands like that, you can't see your hand, the bottom of your hand. So that's the brown water Navy. It's all swift-going rivers. The Delta starts on the Mekong River, starts up in Cambodia and works its way down to the South China Sea. It's operated by the tide, so the tide comes in, goes out. So the river would, the current would actually, it would flow out continuously, but the tide would cause tide changes in the river, the level of the river. It's a pretty mean place to try to navigate any kind of a boat.
As opposed to the blue water Navy, which were the Navy boats that
Out
the
in the
destroyers,
ocean.
aircraft carriers that were out in the ocean, the blue water,
Right.
in other words.
The brown water Navy now, they had what we called the Green Fleet. They operated mostly with the Army. They were Task Force 117. PBRs were a task force all by themselves, Task Force 116. The Green Fleet had what they call ASPBs, which would be a small equivalent to a battleship. An ATC, which would be like a troop carrier. Those are like the old World War II LSTs where the ramp would come down and the soldiers would beach. And they had monitors, and the monitors would either have flamethrowers on the front, or I can't remember the name of the weapon they used, but it would fire a stream of water, more powerful than a water hose from a fire truck. And it was used to destroy bunkers, things like
Now,
this.
you mentioned that was the Green Water Navy.
That was the Green Fleet.
As I remember, the Green Water operated right along the coastline. So they were between the brown water and the blue water. They were up and down they were not in the rivers and canals like the brown Navy.
Oh, yes.
But they were.
Oh, yes.
But they were also, the reason they were called, as I understand it, the Green Fleet, because they were also out more toward the blue Navy. So I guess it was between the blue water and the brown water that they came up with the term the Green Water Navy, which is, I don't know if they have any other colors that I know, but I remember those three. Since we're talking so much about patrol boats, let's tell us about the physical characteristics of a patrol boat. What was it made of? How long was it? What was its armament? How was it powered? So let's start off by giving the audience the dimensions, how long it was, how wide it was, and what it was made of.
Okay. The PBR, I guess, would be the small equivalent to a destroyer. It was made out of 3/8-inch fiberglass. There was no armament on it, no steel. There's nothing on that boat that would stop a bullet. Definitely. There's a couple places that might deflect a bullet, but nothing that would stop one. There's no place on the boat that would stop RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, or a B-40 rocket. So there was no safe place on the PBR, none whatsoever. The boat was 31 feet long, 11 and a half feet wide. It was powered by two 250 horsepower General Motors diesel engines, which powered two jacuzzi pumps, which would produce 70,000 pounds of water thrust from each pump. And that's a lot. That would really move a boat forward. And then they had what they call gates in the back. The gates would deflect the water that the jacuzzi pump would push out. If you pull the levers all the way back for reverse, the gates would turn, and the water jet would hit that gate and go back underneath the boat and cause the boat to move backward.
So being powered by jacuzzi engines, and it could go in pretty shallow areas, could it not?
Yes, it could.
How shallow?
It was. I think the standard would be about 3 to 4 inches. That's what most people would tell you, but it would go in less for a while. The jacuzzi pumps would have to suck water out of the rivers or wherever it's being operated in. The shallower you go, the faster the boat will go, and it would suck up other things like grass and mud and stuff like that if you got too shallow. There's one incident. There's an army facility in Saigon that had slings that could pick up a PBR and move them around. And so in an emergency, they could call these helicopters, come down and put the slings on them and lift the boat up. Well, this one PBR called up and says, "We need assistance. We need a helicopter to come and get us out of our predicament." They says, "Give us the coordinates." So they gave them the coordinates. The helicopter flew over that coordinates, and they looked all around the river and couldn't see them. They said, "I think you made a mistake. There's no boats here." And he says, the coordinates is correct. He said, "Well, if the coordinates is correct, that would put you 1 click inland." And they says, "Roger that." So the helicopter went in 1 click, there they was. They sitting in a rice paddy, and the engines, the strainers and the pumps got clogged up with mud and grass, and so they had to turn the engines off.
Now you referred as 1 click for the audience. A click is how
About
far?
1,000 yards.
All right. So that boat had made it 1,000 yards out of the water, essentially.
Out of the water through a rice paddy.
Oh my gosh! Now you said it was constructed of fiberglass.
Yes.
There's no armament on it.
No.
So when you took fire, fiberglass sometimes has a tendency to splinter, break apart, and can become projectiles pretty dangerous.
Right.
Can you not?
It does. It does. The forward gunner didn't have very much. He was the prime target. Boats always traveled in 2 boat patrols. When the first boat would pass the ambush site, then they would ambush the second boat. But they would wait until the second boat was getting away from them, and they would fire at an angle where they would fire up towards the twin 50 caliber machine guns, because that was half of the firepower of that boat. And then they would concentrate on the engines to try to make the boat dead in the water.
Now we've talked about how it was made up, how long it was, and you've mentioned peripherally some of the armament. But can you tell the audience specifically what the armament was on a boat? How many machine guns did they have, etc.?
People are not going to believe this, because we was very well equipped for any kind of an incident. There was only 4 people on the boat. Each person had their own personal weapon. I had a 30 caliber carbine, and I was up on the forward twin 50s. The boat captain had a pistol, and the other 2 guys had M60 machine guns, M60 rifles. There was 2 50 caliber machine guns forward, an M60 machine gun amidships, and a single 50 caliber machine gun aft. We had Laws rockets, which were like a bazooka of World War II fame, that was anti-tank and anti-bunker, anti-building. It fired a 60 millimeter round, like a 60 millimeter mortar. Matter of fact, the tubes are made of fiberglass, and a lot of the Army folks would fire one and then just throw the tube away because you couldn't reload them. The enemy would grab them and make mortars out of them to fire 60 millimeter mortars right out of the tubes that we discarded. So we had to end up destroying those things. We had 50s, M60s. We had M79 grenade launchers. We did have Laws rockets. We had fragmentation grenades, thermite grenades.
So you were pretty well armed. It
We had
sounds
more
like,
weapons than we had people to use them.
Now, you said you already answered the next question. Well, how many crew members? You said 4 crew members, right? And I assume that each crew member was trained at their position, but they were probably also cross-trained for the other positions. Probably everybody on that boat knew what the other's job was and could perform it. So tell me, what was the overall mission of your patrol boat in Vietnam? What were you instructed, ordered to do? What were your main objectives?
Well, the Navy would call it interdict cross-river traffic. In other words, our job was to go out on the river and be, matter of fact, they called us the game wardens, Operation Game Wardens. So we would go out on the river and we was like policemen. At night, nobody's on the river but us. If we see somebody at night, they're more than likely the enemy, or somebody who's stupid and decides they're going to try to sneak past our boats to go from one area to another. And during the daytime, we searched the watercraft. We'd search sampans and junks. We'd search anywhere from 150 to 200 boats a day.
So this was to stop weapons being brought in or contraband, et cetera. Is that correct?
Correct.
Also, the Viet Cong tried to infiltrate personnel up these rivers and canals, did they not? I mean, colonels, generals, officers, et cetera, important people up and down.
Oh, yes. There's a good example of that. We was out on patrol one day, and just like policemen get a gut feeling about something that is happening on the road, we had that same feeling on the river because we worked with these people day in and day out. And these sampans were coming down the river. And I just had a terrible feeling about this one guy. So I called him alongside. When you call a boat alongside, you go like this. Lade is come here. And you do it like this. You don't go like this because that's how they call their animals. So it's an insult. So you go like this, Lade. The sampan would come alongside. Well, as he's coming alongside, he starts talking to the man in the other sampan, and he wouldn't shut up. So even before we had the chance to search his boat, I said, we're going to keep this guy. They said, why? I said, I got a feeling. There's something that's not right with him. So we pulled him on the boat, and he kept yelling at the other guy. I said, we're going to keep him too. So we kept the other guy too, and we separated him. We turned him in for interrogation. Come to find out, the first guy that we caught on the boat was a VC colonel. He was on his way to Mito, to their district, to find out why he had already been passed over for general twice. I'm sure he'd never make general now. But anyways, the other guy was his aide. And he was telling his aide to go back and tell him what happened to him and get him out of this situation. But
and they were, I assume, were dressed as fishermen or as
just like anybody else.
Going through. Now we talked about the boat and the armament of the boat, the crew members. Was there any mess facilities on it? You couldn't cook on that boat,
No.
could you? Any restroom facilities?
No.
No. So it.
You went in the river.
All right. So when you were out on that boat, this was hardcore.
This is hardcore
life and
death. I guess in today's Army they call it going commando.
Tell us what a typical, and you've already described part of it, a typical daytime patrol was. What, as you went up and down the river, was it mainly stopping, inspecting the various craft? And there were literally hundreds or thousands boats, fishermen, people going to market up and down these rivers. Is that correct?
Correct. Americans have one bad habit. They don't like anything they don't understand. And whenever we bring these civilians alongside in their boats, and we would look at them, and some of them look so pathetic and so poor and so illiterate. And so you think they all are illiterate. And I saw this one old man who was in a sampan, and we was bringing him alongside. And he had dry mud on his pants and shirt and his hands and his feet especially. He was barefooted. He had on black silk, we called them pajamas, but it was their traditional dress. Peasants wear those. And we called him alongside. The first thing he did when he came alongside, he says, can you speak Vietnamese? And I says, no. He says, can you speak French? And I said, no. He says, can you speak Chinese? And I'm getting a little irritated now. And I says, no. And he says, well, I guess I'll have to speak to you in English, but my English isn't very good. And I'm thinking to myself, Bob, who's the stupid one here?
So he knew all the, he
knew
applied,
four
he knew all
languages.
those languages. Oh my gosh. So you said you went out on the nighttime patrols that anybody on the river was assumed to be an enemy or a hostile. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the Vietnamese learned that too. So they stayed off the rivers at
They stayed off
night?
the river at night, most of the time, unless they're trying to cross. There's a petty officer, Williams, that got into a big, heavy firefight with just that, a bunch of Viet Cong trying to cross from the mainland onto a big island. And he caught him flat-footed. And we went back in that area long after Williams had gone home. And the river divisions changed. You don't operate in the same area all the time. We operated in 4 different areas while I was in Vietnam. But when we got down into a place called My Tho, the Vietnamese call it My Ta, we went down to this one island where he had gotten into his firefight. We went around behind the island to set up an ambush position, a night patrol. We was just starting a night patrol, and it was dark, and so our cover boat went in. And as we was leaving, the enemy tried to cross behind our boat. And when they did, they came right into the other boat, and they shot him up. They lit him up.
Now, in Vietnam, there were some areas that were called restricted fire zones, and there were some areas that were called free fire zones. And as the name implies, I can pretty well figure out the difference, but tell us what the difference were when you were in a restricted fire zone or when you were in a free fire zone.
A free fire zone, the firing in any part on the river where PBRs patrol. The PBR, like I said before, is like a policeman. The policeman is the law out on the road. PBRs was the law out on the river. So people would have to get our permission to open fire in a certain area. Helicopters, Army, everybody. If it was out near the river's edge, they would have to call us. We didn't have to call anybody. And if they went into ambush, they would have to call us and give us their ambush positions. If they don't, and we see them moving, we might shoot them. So they always had to call us. We didn't have to tell anybody where we was.
Now, when you were not on patrol, did you have a home base where the patrol boats were? A place I assume had to be in a pretty secure area. I mean, you had to have your boats maintained, and the crews had to have some rest. So, where did you do that? How far was your main base?
The main base was an LST, and very seldom did we see the LST except for in a couple patrol areas where we went directly back to the LST after every patrol. But when I first got to Vietnam, our first base was a YRBM. It was like a floating barracks and repair facility, but it had no engines or rudders and things like that. It had to be towed by tugboats. And so they were anchored out in the middle of a river. And we would go there and we would get minor maintenance taken care of there. If a boat really got shot up real bad, but was still floatable, they could take them down to an LST or down to Mito, and they would repair them. Or I can't remember the major Army base. I don't even remember the name of it now. Na Bay, Na Bay, and Vinh Long. So there was 3 areas where you could take a PBR for major repairs. Another type of base was right on shore down in Mito. We actually tied up to a pier. Whenever we was on Operation Giant Slingshot, we would go up the river and we would stay for our whole patrol period, which was approximately 4 to 6 days. We would stay at like an outpost, and we had tents. And but then we would come back to a YRBM on the river.
Now, one of your tours, I remember you telling me that you had a very unusual encounter with a VC doctor that resulted in a rather unusual deal. So tell us about that, please.
I think I would probably be court-martialed if people was to find out that I did this when I did it. But I thought to myself, during World War II and World War I, and probably even Korea, when people were wounded, doctors were pretty much supposed to be a sacred thing. You didn't shoot them. In VC, they would shoot a doctor. That'd be one of their primary targets. And so I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could turn this incident around? I was out on patrol one night. We was just starting a night patrol, and it was just had turned dark. And this sampan was coming across the river, and it had a woman in it, and she had blood all over her. And she had just got done amputating a leg of a soldier. She didn't tell me she told me it was a South Vietnamese soldier from the South Vietnamese Army, but I was skeptical. And I told her, I said, "You VC?" She said, "No VC, no VC." And so I talked to her and I says, "Look," I says, "don't try to mess with me." I said, "You're a doctor, you went through school, so you know how to speak English." I says, "So don't lie to me." I says, "Tell me the truth." And so she did. And I told her, I said, you could be shot for being out here. And she says, "Yes, but I had to get back to my village." I says, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do." I says, "I know that you are a VC. I know this. I feel it in my heart." I says, "But I'm going to let you go." And I said, "The reason why I'm going to let you go is I want you to think very carefully how kind we have been to you and how understanding. And I'm hoping and praying that if you run across an American soldier who's been captured by the VC, that you give him all the help that he needs. If he needs medical assistance, you make sure, and you make sure he's not mistreated." And she just smiled. She said, "Ua," which means yes.
Well, let's hope she did that.
I hope she did it. I never ran across anybody that says they knew anything different, but I really felt good that day after I did that. And I thought, if you ever did anything compassionate in your life, this was it.
Now you volunteered to do a second tour in Vietnam.
Yes.
Why would you do that?
The U.S. Navy contacted all the guys that had spent time on PBRs. They was looking for volunteers to go back to Vietnam as an advisor to a South Vietnamese river patrol group to try to get them ready. It was part of the Vietnamization program, the start of it. So I went back.
Well, during that Vietnamization, when more and more responsibility was being handed over to the South Vietnamese, how did that go? Wasn't there a officer, a crew, I don't know, a mutiny or something close to that involving the South Vietnamese?
Yes, it
Can
was.
you tell us that story?
We was out on patrol one day. It was a day patrol. And the Vietnamese were arguing with the patrol officer. The patrol officer was an officer. The other were all enlisted. And they got to arguing back and forth. I didn't understand what they was arguing about. All I could think was, if this was American Navy, there's no way these kids would be talking to that officer that way. But that's up to them. They'll have to deal with that themselves. Next thing I know, I turned my back to do something. I heard a shot. And the officer had pulled a .38 caliber pistol. And this kid ran across behind the after 50 machine gun, and he shot at him. And he hit the splinter, what we called a splinter shield. And it deflected the bullet. And he was getting ready to take aim again. Meanwhile, the other sailors ran and grabbed their M16 rifles. Now, he's aiming at this kid. The other crew members aiming at him. And the other boat, which was our cover boat, was all aiming their weapons at our boat. And I thought to myself, Bob, you are in serious trouble. If they kill this officer, they're going to kill you next, because you're the only witness. And I said, you better think fast. Think fast. So I was all smiles, and I was going up to these guys. I said, put the weapon down. Blah, 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 blah. He's going to shoot at us. He's going to kill us. No, he won't. I'll guarantee you he won't. I said, if he shoots one of you, I'll shoot him. I says, put your weapons down. I says, go up to the bow of the boat. I says, carry your weapons with you. So I went over to the officer, and he was holding on his .38. I said, put your .38 down. I says, I'm not going to try to take it. I said, I don't want it. I got my own gun. I says, but don't aim it at me. You just increase the problem. And so he did. And meanwhile, the other kid had come from behind the after 50 and ran up on the bow of the boat. I said, I told one of the other guys, I said, get on the radio and tell those guys to move those weapons away from us. Pardon the language, but I says, tell them they're beginning to piss me off. And don't be aiming those guns at us. So they did. And they knew we were serious then. So I told the patrol officer, I said, let's go back to the base. So I got down on the radio. Meanwhile, all the other sailors were up front. So I knew they couldn't hear me. I said, we got an incident here. I says, drive down to the pier. I just get the Jeep, come down to the pier and meet me. But do not come on the base, because I don't know what's going to happen when our boat comes in. Because everybody hated this officer. So I walked alongside the officer, and we walked back, and I was waving at the other guys and joking with them and things like this, and I was scared to death the whole time. Finally, we made it through the gate, and he went his way, and I got on board on the Jeep, and they asked me what had happened, and I told them. So they contacted Saigon. They contacted the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese sent an admiral out. And he says, was you the advisor on the boat? And I said, yes, sir. He says, I'm going to ask you your advice. He said, have you patrolled with these people before? And I said, yes, sir. He says, what happened? I told him. And he says, what would you recommend? And I says, well, I says, in my Navy, I says, every one of these youngsters would be in serious trouble for confronting the officer like that. I said, I don't know what it's like in your Navy. I said, in wartime, they would have been shot. I said, but I don't know in your Navy. I said, but I wouldn't recommend that. I says, I would recommend that they all look forward when the patrol is over to be able to go home. And I says, don't let them go home. I says, restrict them to the base for a couple months. Take away some of their pay. And he said, what about the officer? I says, he's in danger if he ever goes back out on the river again. I would recommend. He's an ex-Army officer. How he got in on PBRs, I don't know. But I understand he's a good, I like him. He's one of my favorite officers to patrol with. I says, I would recommend you send him back to the Army. And so that's what they did.
Now, during your second tour, Chief, you were seriously wounded. So tell us about that day and your hospitalization and your recuperation, please.
I didn't get hospitalized. I never told very many people this story because I didn't know whether they would believe me or not. And personally, I didn't care whether they would or not. But we got into a firefight on July 16th, 1969. We was going up the river. We had just come back from what they call a medcap mission down at an outpost. And unusual, instead of having 2 boats, we had 4. So the first 3 boats went past, started past the ambush position, and we was the last boat. Now, by rights, I should have been the one to get killed because they would normally hit the last boat in the patrol. But my best friend on the river was on the forward gun tub in his boat, which was the 3rd boat. And he wasn't down inside on his guns. We was in an area we thought was very, 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 very secure. Because right across from us, there's an outpost there. But it's all Vietnamese. All of a sudden, we got ambushed. And so we fired back. And I got some shrapnel in my face, all down the right side of my face. I was picking pieces out of my face for a long time. But it fractured my eye socket. I had plastic frame glasses, and the glasses were melted right in here. It fractured the eye socket, and a big splinter of bone was sticking out. And so I looked, and I says, where we got ambushed, it turned into a 90-degree turn up the river. And the other boats were rushing back up the river because everybody, not everybody, but most of the people on the boat was either killed or wounded. Well, there's only 1 killed, but so everybody else was wounded. And from where the VC was, all they had to do was lob RPGs and B-40 rockets up the river, and they would have hit something. So I told my boat captain, I said, make firing runs. So we kept making fire runs until I ran out of ammunition, and the other guys did too. And then we headed back up the river. By then, they were all up to medevac, and they had called for what they call a dust-off. It's a military helicopter that takes out wounded and dead. And when we pulled our boat in, we pulled it in alongside our cover boat, the one that was ambushed. And I saw my friend laying on the deck of the boat. And they said he's dead. And I felt bad. I really felt bad. We was waiting for the dust off to come in. And so I was working with my weapon, and I kept looking over at his boat and looking at him, working some more. Then I looked back at him again. When I looked back at him again, I saw his eyes were open when they was closed before. I said, he's not dead. His eyes are open. So he was the first one we medevaced. And I would help to pick up his body to put it on the litter. And I was holding on to his leg. And I picked up, and his boot came off of my hand with his foot in it. He was just about blown up in every which way.
But he was still alive at that point.
He lived for 10 hours. He died in a MASH unit in Saigon.
Now, did you say you were not hospitalized?
I was not hospitalized. The hospital corpsman came down to my boat when we pulled in alongside, and he says, "You're going to need stitches. You need some help there." And I says, I'll take care of my boat first. He said, well, come up to sick bay when you're done. And I thought to myself, they're going to tell me I've got concussion, and they're going to take me off the boat. And the last thing a PBR sailor wants is to be taken off his boat. He wants to be out there for every patrol. Don't ask me why. It sounds like a dumb thing. But you don't want somebody else to get killed in your place. So you don't want to go out. You don't want to be off the boat. So I grabbed some tools from our engineman, some wire cutters and things like this. And I went down to the head, and I cleaned off the blood to where I can see. And I sat there with a pair of wire cutters and was cutting the bone. It's all around the edge of the bone, and bone's hard to cut with wire cutters. And I cut and cut and cut until I got a groove around the piece of bone. Then I took a pair of pliers and went like this until it snapped. And after it snapped...
That's hurting me to hear this.
It's painful.
It must have been terrible, painful.
So I cleaned the blood off and all and dried the whole area, and then I took some Scotch tape and I taped the cut. And I didn't tell anybody. And they saw that that I had gotten wounded when we went in to dust off. So when they made the list for the Purple Hearts, my name was on that list.
Do you ever have any problems with your bone? You're describing an orbital, what we call an orbital blowout fracture.
I know it.
Did you ever have any problems later on? And
No, I can't believe it, but no.
that's amazing. Now, after your discharge from the Navy, you went to work for the United States government. Tell us what you did for the United States government and how that was related to your military work, please.
Well, for 4 years after I got out of the Navy, I went to work for Honeywell Corporation, working for their Marine Systems Division, and I worked with torpedoes. The same torpedo I worked with in the Navy for 22 years, minus the 2 years in Vietnam. Honeywell had bought the rights to that torpedo and was going to change it to solid state, but they needed somebody who knew the weapon, and I taught it at the PBR school for 9 years, so I knew that weapon inside out. Most people back in 1983, when they get out, they're offered anywhere from $18,000 to $22,000, $23,000 a year to start, and that's good wage, that's good pay back in those days. But Honeywell offered me $35,000 a year to start. There's no way I could turn that down. So I got out, and I missed my chance. I was selected E9, and that was my goal, was to retire as an E9. I made E9, but I couldn't retire as an E9.
You retired as an E8. That's the senior chief status.
Senior
right?
chief. E9 was master chief.
Okay. All right.
And so we went to Ecuador one time, working with the U.S. Embassy down there, and we was attacked by the Shining Path guerrilla group, and got that all taken care of, and we did everything we needed to do in Ecuador. Went to Israel, went to a base there, and they told us it was a secret base, but it wasn't too much of a secret because it was attacked by by some Syrians, commando group. And we didn't know they was being attacked, and they wouldn't let us leave the base. The base went on lockdown. And they says, we'll let you know when you can leave. And we heard shooting, and then they come and said, well, you can leave now. But you didn't see anything and you didn't hear anything. I says, what didn't I see and what didn't I hear? And they says, some commandos tried to come ashore and we shot them. And they says, good enough for me. So we left. And we stayed and finished that job there. After 4 years, I went to work with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA has 10 FEMA headquarters throughout the United States. But I went to work for FEMA MERS, Mobile Emergency Response Support. And we only had 5 areas that we operated. So each MERS detachment would take care of 2 FEMA regions. And we went to a lot of disasters, 9/11, the bombing from this character by the name of McVeigh who bombed the building in Oklahoma City. We went to floods, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes. We went to all of these areas.
Well, you've certainly lived an adventuresome life. After you retired from your civilian job, I understand you lived in the state of Washington,
Yeah.
but yet here we are at New Smyrna Beach, Florida, and I'm told you have a story, which you call your Sleepless in Seattle story. How?
Yeah.
Kind of
Anybody
explain.
who saw Sleepless in Seattle would know the story.
Well, tell the audience about your story.
Well, I didn't live in Seattle, but I live about 40 miles north of Seattle in a place called Lake Stevens. This lady did not live in Baltimore, but she lived in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Her husband passed away after 45 years of marriage with a heart attack. My wife had passed away after 44 years of marriage, complications of cancer, colon cancer. So a friend of ours, Pat, this lady in New Smyrna Beach, had known this other lady she had met at some function that she had gone to in Chicago. And that lady lived in Lake Stevens, Washington, and she worked part-time at a gym. And I would attend this gym. And I was walking my treadmill one day, and she come up to me and asked, she said, I have a friend that just lost her husband not too long ago, but she's having a harder time dealing. She said, you seem to be adjusting very well. She says, maybe you can call her and give her some kind of encouragement. I said, sure. So make a long story short, we was calling back and forth. This was from May 18th, 2008, which we call our anniversary. And we talked back and forth. And I said, I got to put a face to this name, to this voice. I said, would you mind if I come down to visit you? She said, sure. There's a hotel down the street you can stay at. And I said, okay. So I went down there in September. I figured 4 days is what I'll do. I can do anything for 4 days. If she doesn't like me, I can go to the beach for 4 days. I said, if she does like me, it'll give me incentive to come back. But initially, before going there in September, we made arrangements that I would come and see her just before Christmas. And I had already made those arrangements. So I didn't cancel them. So after the 4 days, I went back home. We talked on the phone back and forth. December came around, and I asked her, you want me to keep those? And she, oh, yes, keep those reservations. So December came around. I came back. I called her. I said, I'm coming. She said, okay, you can stay in the hotel down the street. So I went down there, down to New Smyrna Beach, and we was there for 4 days again. And I went with her to Sarasota to meet her daughters. I was scared to death to meet her daughters because I thought they're going to think, oh, he's trying to muscle in on Dad and all that, and they're going to be skeptical and all. I never got such a warm greeting in my life. They were fantastic people, very, very nice. To this day, they felt like my daughters. So after December, she ended up coming up to Washington State, and the rest of the time, I guess, as they say, is history. But we got together, and
So now you're here in New Smyrna Beach.
yeah. So I was still working for FEMA. I worked with them for 23 and a half years. So I was still working with them when I met her. So I had to wait until I retired, which was another year. And then in 2010, I came down to New Smyrna Beach and stayed.
Well, Chief, in closing, I always ask all Vietnam veterans the question I'm going to ask you next. From a 50-year perspective, looking back on Vietnam, is there anything you think, what do you think about the Vietnam War, the way it was conducted by the United States? What are your thoughts on that, if you have any?
I have some thoughts. I don't know what everybody's political affiliation is, but I'm out of that. I'm out of the politics. I'm concerned with the servicemen. And I found out later on because the Secretary of Defense McNamara came on TV and he admitted that the war should have ended years before it did. That he and Johnson, President Johnson, was making a lot of money off that war. And so they kept the war going. And I really have a lot of fault with that. That really hurts. It really hurts.
Well, I think the Pentagon Papers showed that Secretary of Defense McNamara and other people in higher really did know a lot more about how bad things were going before it ever really went bad to the public. But in any event, Chief, I want to thank you first of all for taking your time to come here today to tell your story. And it's a great story. I'm sure the audience appreciates that and learn from it. To thank you for your service, and just to say from all of us, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you, Chief.
Thank you. I'd like to mention one thing
Sure.
in closing, is for people who like to watch war movies and things like that, you'll hear the military in the movie saying, ooh-ah, hoorah, ooh-ah, and all kinds of oohs and whatever. All of that came, I believe, from the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese had a word for yes, and it was ooh-ah. Sounds very similar to the words that are being used today. It meant ooh-ah. Back in those days, if the sergeant asked everybody, did you clean your weapons, they would say, "Ooh, Sergeant." Yes, Sergeant, in other words. And somehow the word "ooh" got changed around. But that's where the origin of that word and what it really, really meant.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thank you, Chief.
Thank you very much.